Great. Good morning. Yeah, the story that Hakeem tells is quite similar. I had the experience, in preparation for this and through some of the research that we've been doing on Bitcoin. I'm American-Canadian, as you can probably tell by the accent. So I bought some Bitcoin in the States, transferred it within an hour over to BTC China, and cashed out in Chinese yuan in under an hour. So for a capital-controlled currency, this is really, really kind of a critical aspect and something that we'll talk about a little bit more. Briefly, so as I mentioned, I'm American-Canadian. As you can tell, I'm not Chinese, but I've lived in China for about 10 years. My background has always been in financial technology, worked for Citibank, worked for Intel, and now Kapronasia. And very briefly, we are a Shanghai-based research and advisory company focused on the financial services industry. And so Bitcoin for us started, I guess, about 3 or 4 months ago when some of our clients started asking about what's happening in China. And so our team of analysts who's there in the mainland are all mainland Chinese, so who better to look into it than young 20-something Chinese. And so the period of discovery that we had over the next 2 months was pretty incredible. And the story with China and Bitcoin is quite nuanced and quite complex. If the currency is really going to take off, China probably needs to be a part of that, although that's a question for us to talk about today as well. So what I want to do today is just walk you through a little bit about what's happening here. There are a number of China experts in the room. Rich, who's here today, lives in Shanghai as well, so I'm sure he can help you out, and then I'm more than happy to answer questions at the end of this as well. So we kind of covered the basics of Bitcoin at the beginning. So I'm going to skip over this slide. China. To set the context of China, it's right now the world's second largest economy. It passed Japan and Germany over the past couple of years to be second behind the US. It's the #1 population. You can see the GDP per capita, so the average income is quite low compared to other places in the world. But for many individuals and companies, China is the next place. It is the market of opportunity. When you have 1.4 billion consumers, the old adage, if you can just have 1% of that, you're rich. Of course, a lot of companies come to China and say that and end up going away penniless. China is a unique dichotomy as well. If you haven't been there before, you go to a city like Shanghai, there's a Starbucks every other corner. You can actually map out where you want to go. Oh, to get to my place, you just go down, take a left at the Starbucks, take a right at the next one, you're at my place. But at the same time, there's tremendous developing world problems like pollution. Right now, I'm kind of glad that I'm not in Shanghai because the pollution is about 260 parts per million of 2.5 PM. Those are the ones that get in your lungs and kill you. New York during rush hour is 50. So it's 5 times that. And Beijing is even worse than Shanghai. So it's a unique dichotomy where it's the world's second largest economy, biggest population, but it still has a lot of the growing problems that many developing economies have. Now, talk about internet usage in China. Somebody brought up the point earlier today about taking business models, innovating for the local market. The Chinese are incredibly wired. If you ride on the metro in Shanghai, and of course I say Shanghai, and we all know that that's not all of China, but it's representative of kind of first-tier cities, everybody will be not on an iPhone, but on a Samsung of some sort, including the notes that they talk on the phone on the subway as well. It's an incredibly wired place. Many people are online. Sites like from Alibaba, Taobao is huge for buying anything. If you're not familiar with Taobao, it's kind of a mix of Amazon and eBay where you can buy anything from mask filters to cars, to lingerie. Whatever you want, you can buy on one site. But the interesting thing about the internet population in China, it is the largest in the world. And these are 2012 numbers, so it's probably even higher, but just under 600 million. But that's still only penetration of 41%, whereas the US is 78% penetration with many fewer users. So there's tremendous room for growth, and we've seen this in e-commerce in China. Now, why do I bring this slide up? Well, this is to kind of set the stage for Bitcoin in China, because increasingly you have a younger population that's used to being online, is tech savvy, and is growing in wealth and income, which kind of sets the stage for what we've been seeing over the past couple weeks, which is supposedly China driving the price of Bitcoin up, whether that's true or not, or if you believe in that. So if you look at the status of Bitcoin in China from a purely usage perspective, this is something that I learned, and there are people that have been involved with Bitcoin much longer than me in the audience, but it's very difficult to measure the exact usage of Bitcoin just because of the anonymous nature of the currency. So you have to look at wallet downloads or bit nodes within the space. So China, if you measure by wallets downloaded, is the second largest in the world, so cumulative wallets downloaded over the course of time. And in May 2013, an interesting thing happened where there was a CCTV documentary on Bitcoin. And we'll get into a little bit about what this means from a governmental perspective in just a minute. But in May, there was a huge spike in wallet downloads to 84,000. China is also second as measured by bit nodes. So there were 14,000 in September. So what this slide shows is basically the wallet downloads and a percentage of the total global wallet downloads for that period of time. So if you look in May, I'm not sure if I have a laser on this or not, but yeah, so if you look in May here, that's the 84,000 number, and at that point, that 84,000 downloads represented about 30% of the global downloads of the Bitcoin wallet off of SourceForge at that particular time. So there's tremendous interest in China, certainly in the wallets and getting involved in Bitcoin in the space. This takes a look at the top 10 countries around the world. So just looking at those top 10 countries, there's about, outside of this graph, there's about 32%. So this graph represents just about 70% of the total population. US has the most active nodes, followed by Germany and then China, and the rest down. So this is going from roughly nothing at the beginning of this year to where it is today. Why is Bitcoin interesting in China? If you're familiar with China, there are a number of reasons for this. I've tried to lay out a few of them here. For the average investor in China, because the currency is capital controlled, so Chinese nationals and indeed us foreigners can only take 50,000 equivalent, legally take $50,000 equivalent outside of the country. So if you're sitting on $1 million in China and you want to invest in something outside of China, you can legally only do that $50,000 at a time unless you go through one of the government-sponsored programs. So there's very limited investment choices, and that's why we've seen the real estate market in China skyrocket, is because if you can't put your money in the stock market, if your mattress is already full of money, the banks are giving you less than 1%, where else are you going to put your money? And there are some other options that have come up in the past couple months, but property has been one of the big areas of growth within China, and now we're seeing that within Bitcoin as well, because it's an opportunity for people to put money in there. And real estate is one of the few investments in China that has been consistently going up. The growth, even with the government trying to put stops on it, limiting the amount that people can buy, it's still increasing rapidly. So it's another investment option is the first point. Second point, huge population, huge potential growth for Bitcoin. I would say, of the users that we're seeing in China, if you look at that 84,000, that's a fraction of a percent of the entire population of China. So there's huge growth. If that penetration gets similar to what the internet penetration was, the numbers we're talking about are incredible for this. It's a capital-controlled currency. As I mentioned before, legally getting your money in and out of China is a little bit more challenging. Although with the example that I used earlier and what Hakeem was saying about transferring money in and out, with Bitcoin it's actually quite easy now, which is something that will probably get the government's attention shortly. The last point is China is traditionally a very cash-based society. If you look at the history of the Cultural Revolution, I won't get into too many details here, but it's Singapore, so I can be a little bit more politically incorrect with my comments, but the Cultural Revolution wiped out a lot of people's wealth. So the trust in the government and the trust in anything that they can't touch is very little. That being said, that's changing rapidly. We're seeing people put money onto platforms like Alipay, like Tenpay. People are starting to get, especially the younger generation, more comfortable with virtual currencies. So that's an opportunity and a driver for Bitcoin in China as well. The key factors for potential growth in the market, visibility. So as I mentioned before, CCTV2 did a documentary earlier this year. Now, understand the context of this. CCTV is a government-controlled station. So in theory, anything that goes across CCTV is government approved. So there's some kind of tacit approval that goes into that before it's actually put on air. Now, that being said, the government hasn't said anything about Bitcoin yet. And we'll talk a little bit more about regulations in a bit, but it's a sign that at least somebody within the government space recognizes that Bitcoin is there. The other point on the visibility is it was used for charitable donations during the Yan'an earthquake. So one of the organizations that was tied to that was accepting Bitcoins as donations for the reconstruction after the earthquake. Usability, if you use BTC China, you know they use 10Pay, so you can deposit to your bank account, withdraw from your bank account, or you can use 10Pay. If you're not familiar with 10Pay or Alipay, you should, because they're coming outside of China soon, but it's equivalently the PayPal of China. So it allows you to do online payments between people, between companies, everything on China. So there is some acceptability with Alipay and 10Pay for buying Bitcoins. So that's, the usability is there. Qcoin was another virtual currency that had a very short, well, it's still being used, but not as much in China. It was originally launched by Tencent, which is one of the large internet providers. They provide WeChat, which I'm sure many of you have on your phone as well. Qcoins were originally used to purchase virtual goods, so swords, money, food, whatever you buy in your virtual games. They eventually switched to offline transactions as well, and they started to be used for some illegal activities. The government got wind of what was happening and started to put their thumb down on Tencent to control Qcoin a little bit more. Now, the interesting aspect about that is, although the Chinese are used to the virtual currency and the government is used to that, it's tough to regulate Bitcoin because you can't put your thumb down on a company to control it, right? Now, you can put your thumb down on BTC China or how you get your money on and off the platform and in and out of Bitcoin, I should say, but there's no centralized company. So that would be interesting about how the government handles that. The third point is investability. The Chinese love speculation and they love investing. The stock market up until from 2003 to 2008 about tripled over that time. I mean, Bitcoin has tripled in less than that time. So the Chinese are really into the idea of investability, and we'll talk a little bit more about the mining in just a minute. And finally, it's the alternative investment channel. Very briefly on payments for Bitcoin in China. Although pretty much anywhere around the world, payments and what you can use Bitcoin for is somewhat limited. In China, it's also limited. We found one cafe in Beijing where you could buy your coffee with Bitcoin. Somebody mentioned that was probably a front for a money laundering organization. And I said, what, the coffee is $10,000 a cup. Like, what's money laundering about that? But seem to have different ideas. Online, there are a couple, we'll do a comparison chart in just a minute about some of the online transactions. And the last thing is property. And so we'll talk about that in a minute as well. So using Bitcoin in China for payment, just a little comparison. This is when we first kind of started doing our research around this, and this is today. So you can see Taobao and PayPay are two kind of online platforms where you can buy things, you can buy goods, you can buy services. So that's increased a bit since from September to November. Now keep in mind, I mean, we're all used to things happening so fast in this space. This is actually only a month, so it's actually quite a small period of time. Keep that in mind. I know we're all thinking in minutes and seconds with Bitcoins, but that's quite rapid growth. I mean, that's 3 times growth. Bitcoin services starting to expand, as well as what you can use it for. So there are some companies, this Huanle 95 can use for reward points. You can exchange Bitcoins for that. You can, when you buy products on their site, you get rewards points for using it. Now, a lot of the things that you hear about Bitcoin, and Steve mentioned this before as well, about the Chinese government using it for virtual currency, using it as essentially a hedge against the US dollar to be more of a dominant reserve currency globally. About a month and a half ago, there was a story about Baidu where you could buy software using Bitcoins. A lot of what you find, these are very small examples, and most of the people that are involved in these examples are quite hedged. About a week and a half ago, there was, well, no, actually at the end of October, so nearly 2 weeks ago, Shanda, which is one of the large technology providers and gaming providers in China, has a real estate arm. And they, in this particular area of Shanghai, Zhangjiang, which is a high-tech area in one of the development areas in Shanghai, they had a property development. And so they accepted Bitcoin as payment for properties in that development. Now, as in any other, as we talked about this before, with any other real estate development in Shanghai or China, the entire thing was sold out in a matter of minutes, the entire building of 300 apartments. What was interesting about this is Shanda is very much a technology provider and player in the market. So a lot of their employees, a lot of the people that are familiar with their platform, a lot of the people in Zhangjiang are very young, high-tech savvy kind of people. So these are the kind of target base that people might be interested in purchasing property with Bitcoin. The one thing that was interesting about this, though, is they did say that they were taking it at the exchange rate of 1,000 renminbi per Bitcoin. And this was, at the time, I think it was 1,200, 1,300 renminbi, Chinese yuan. Sorry, I use the terms interchangeably, but Chinese yuan to 1 Bitcoin. So they were hedging their bets, and they said they could adjust it at any time. For the Bitcoins they did get, obviously they made a lot of money. I mean, doubled their money since this happened, pretty much. Everything was bought off plan, as I mentioned before, so they didn't even see the apartments, which is quite common in China. It was bought between 28,000 renminbi per square meter, which is actually a little bit cheap for China, especially in this area. But it's unknown exactly how many people purchased using Bitcoin. But again, it's another example of how China, in a lot of the internet startups and a lot of the technology that we're seeing, are taking international business models and adapting them for the local environment. And so this could be an example of something that might continue in the future. Some people talk about the arbitrage opportunity between renminbi and the US dollar and Bitcoin. So this isn't that complex, but we just looked at, and I hate using Mt. Gox as a comparison, but because it's one of the larger ones, we still use that. But you can see that they roughly track each other. What's interesting here is that actually it's a little bit, the renminbi is a little bit higher. So there is actually an arbitrage opportunity if you were looking to, if you could somehow, we were talking about this earlier today actually as well, buy Bitcoins in dollars and then sell them in renminbi if you had a way of getting your money back into US dollars if you were short renminbi. But really there's not too much change. You can see here there's a slight lag with what's happening in the Chinese exchange, but I would argue that now China is actually leading, so the lag might be in the Western exchanges rather than the Chinese BTC China exchanges. I won't go into too much detail on this because it escapes my technical expertise and I hate being proven wrong on something, so I won't dwell on it too long. But mining in China, very similar to other places, it started off CPU, GPU, and then went to ASIC chips. Some of the large stable providers of ASIC chips are coming out of China. Some of the stories around this are incredible. There's one company, I believe it was Avalon, that makes microchips. And just for anybody taking pictures of the slides, we'll figure out a way to distribute these afterwards. So you don't have to take photos of every slide. If you're taking photos of me, that's fine though. So Avalon, as an example, they produce chips that cost about 25 cents and they sell them for $10. And that's just a chip that goes in the ASIC USB chip that goes into the bigger mining device. So the companies around mining have made a tremendous amount of money from this. There's also stories about companies that have been set up using Bitcoin as equity investment in the company, and your dividends are paid back in Bitcoin as they mine going through. So there's a tremendous return on this. These are some of the recouping the investment. So a couple of the machines from ASIC.me, which was one of the big providers. So you could buy, for their largest machine at the time was 100 Bitcoins or US dollars at that. And the time to recoup investment was about 77 days. Today, so these numbers were about from September. Today, you can divide all of these returns by 10. So in other words, your return here of $23 is now $2.33. So that's changing rapidly. But that being said, there was a lot of money being made in China on mining earlier in this year because they had huge data centers that were just mining and set up with these ASIC machines. There are a couple different ways that you could actually mine. You could buy the equipment yourself. You could set it up yourself. There were companies that also kind of similar to a data center would allow you to put their mining machine in there and give you the internet connectivity and the power for your machine. So all you had to do is bring your own machine. And then there were certain players as well that provided full hosting. So you didn't even have to bring your own machine. They would provide you the machine. You would lease it out for a certain period of time, which is much common in the other places as well. And then you would get the dividends and returns off of that. And for that, they would take a percentage of the revenue generated. So again, these guys are making a lot of money as well. Actually, this Avalon, when they first started producing in that price, was hosting for a period of time as well. So hosting for a couple months was included in the initial price. So a lot of people just left their machines in Avalon's data center to actually do the mining. There should be numbers on this, actually. Not sure why. Must be a problem with, okay. Well, I'll make sure on the printed out ones that these numbers are coming out. I'm not too good with PowerPoint, so it might not have been my fault that this happened. But basically what this graph should be showing you is that the volume that's going across BTC China as a percentage of the global volume, as a percentage of Mt. Gox's volume is increasing rapidly, especially in the past couple months, to the point that it's essentially, if you look at this graph, you can see from the line here that there's nothing happening. So if there, in all seriousness, if there was a line here, it would be down here at the beginning, up here in kind of May, and now it's almost parity. So it's almost, the volume of BTC China almost matches 100% of Mt. Gox. Now, we all know that Mt. Gox has had problems with withdrawals, and that's affected their volume, and it's not a perfect comparison, but it gives you an idea of what's happening there. So last couple slides. I'm not sure, how am I on time? I'm okay? Yeah, okay. Last couple of slides. Situation today, and the future of Bitcoin in China is unclear, as it is probably anywhere. Bitcoin in China has a lot of things going for it, but mass acceptance really requires, mass acceptance of the currency requires more acceptance infrastructure to be able to purchase things for it. I was having a conversation with somebody a couple of days ago who said, what's the actual value? Actually, this is one of my analysts. And she says, okay, you're making money on Bitcoin. What's the actual value? What's the proper value of Bitcoin? And it's impossible to tell right now, actually, because in Singapore, you can buy a hamburger for $3. You can buy a house for $3 million. There's relativity there, relatively within the currency and then between currencies as well, because that house for 3 million Singapore dollars is worth a certain amount in US dollars, whereas Bitcoin doesn't have that. So it's chicken and egg. That's not just China where that's an issue. Some big announcements, but you have to take those with a grain of salt. So make sure that, if you're looking at anything in China related to Bitcoin, make sure you understand what the announcements actually are. I mean, the property thing is pretty big. And if that continues, again, keep in mind that a lot of these announcements have just happened this year. So the acceptance level is increasing rapidly. It's just going to take time and education. The big gorilla in the room is the regulators, though. They haven't shown up to the party yet. They obviously kind of understand that Bitcoin is there, but the people that are working at CCTV are likely the younger generation, and it's the old dudes who sit in Beijing at Zhongnanhai that are going to be making the decisions. And so this probably hasn't hit their radar yet, although it's definitely on the radar of the Chinese government. Now, speaking to some people here about Singapore regulations earlier today, Singapore will likely follow what the US does or what the EU does in larger economies, just because it's a smaller market here. China has the potential of really making or breaking Bitcoin and its acceptance. And I think, if China made a move on the regulatory front, the US would almost be forced to follow to a certain extent, because there's such a large economic connection between the two. I mentioned before the Q coin. We talked about this. Can they actually push, who can they put their thumb on if Bitcoin gets out of control? They can't really control it. They can't control somebody going, in the old-fashioned way of getting Bitcoin and going and actually meeting somebody face-to-face and trading money for Bitcoins. They can't stop that from happening, really. They can stop the merchants. They can stop the BTC Chinas. They can stop the Alipays. They can't stop Bitcoin itself. So how do they do it? Two views. If you're bullish, they'll tacitly accept, or it'll be a light touch. The second point here is kind of interesting. A number of companies in China are essentially non-profit companies. In other words, they never turn a profit. They book expenses. You go out to dinner, you get the official receipts called fapiao. You book those against your revenue. You rarely make a profit. We, Kapronasia, are a profitable company, but not in China. And it's completely legal. Now, the government could crack down on that a little bit more and could really enforce that and really get into too much detail. But there's kind of a status quo, and they're kind of happy with the way that is. The same thing could happen with Bitcoin. It could be very light touch, where there's not too much regulation that's there. Because of the potential implications in the capital control, it's probably going to be a little bit more heavier touch. So that's a big risk for it. Online acceptance really isn't a problem, but I think there's a lot of people that are hesitant because they're not sure about what the government is going to do yet. So again, the government has, in this room, just keep this within this room, but has wiped out a lot of value in people's lives. You know, move them to different parts of China, taken away their money, burn their books, et cetera, et cetera. So is the trust in the government there? Yes, but do they feel that they can trust the government with Bitcoin? Maybe not. So we think a lot of what's happening right now is speculative behavior in China. The bearish scenario, regulators come down hard, only niche providers accept, and Bitcoin remains a bit player in China. I would say one other aspect, one other potential that could come up on this is China developing their own version of this. As they've done with 3G. If you go to use 3G in China, you can use international 3G or China's 3G. And you'll be happy to know the same thing is happening with 4G in China, which is great. So questions and answers. I mean, I'll open the question up for you guys if you want to ask me any questions now or afterwards. But some questions, as I was putting this through, that came to mind that I have for you as a whole and for you to think about over the rest of today is, what is the right value of Bitcoin? You know, thinking about that $3 hamburger or $3 million apartment, will Chinese regulators take a stance? So do you see them taking a stance? And then although growth of Bitcoin is fast, what can be done to make it faster? And the last question, which I find the most interesting, and because I'm mainly China focused, I don't think about this that much, but I thought, you know, is China actually necessary for Bitcoin adoption globally? Does China need to be part of the equation, or can it happen everywhere outside of China? So those are just kind of rhetorical questions for you guys to think about as you go through the rest of today. And yeah, that's all I had. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer.